Russia's war against Ukraine has escalated significantly this year, but it did not start in February or even in 2014. Its roots are far deeper and more malign than just territorial ambitions. Today, I'm exploring how Russia got to this point and where it goes next, with a person perhaps best equipped to answer this question and a long-standing critic of the Kremlin, David Satter. Russia's attempts to control, coerce, and dominate Ukraine have deep roots in its Soviet and imperialist past and are very much a byproduct of the weakness and internal dynamics of its aging totalitarian regime. David Satter is a journalist and historian who has written extensively about Russia and the Soviet Union, especially the decline and fall of the USSR and rise of post-Soviet Russia. David became the first American journalist to be expelled from Russia since the Cold War in December 2013. This was perhaps not a surprising move, given that his books have covered topics such as the FSB's role in the apartment bombings that brought Putin to power and the criminalization of Russia under Boris Yeltsin. David's core theme is why a pluralist and progressive state did not emerge from the collapse of the Soviet Union and how this understanding guides its current policies and actions. From 1976 to 1982, David was the Moscow correspondent of the Financial Times and then became a special correspondent on Soviet affairs for the Wall Street Journal. He is currently a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute and a fellow of Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. He's been a research fellow at the Hoover Institute at Stanford University and a visiting professor at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. As well as numerous articles, he is also the author of several books that are essential reading to help understand the origins of the current crisis, including the brilliantly named books It Was a Long Time Ago, and It Never Happened Anyway, Russia and the Communist Past, Darkness at Dawn, The Rise of the Russian Criminal State, and The Less You Know, the Better You Sleep, Russia's Road to Terror and Dictatorship under Yeltsin and Putin. David, welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be with you.
So your interest in Russia as a culture, a history, and a force in the world, that goes back a long way. What really triggered that interest?
Well, I was a child of the Cold War, and it was quite natural, really, growing up in the 1950s, 1960s, to be interested in the Soviet Union. After all, they were the great adversary of the free world. And in the eyes of many people, they were the hope for the future. They offered the promise of a utopian system that would solve all social problems, that would abolish war, that would establish equality, end oppression, end class conflict. Well, it was a very appealing image, and of course, it attracted interest on the part of people who were concerned about the world, concerned about the future of humanity. And even at a young age, I was such a person.
And it didn't really turn out that way, has it? I mean, were you
No, it didn't.
No, quite the opposite. And were you surprised when Russia expanded its invasion of Ukraine in February this year?
Well, only in the sense that I assumed that such a move would lead to absolutely catastrophic losses and possible destabilization of Russia itself, which is, I think, what we're seeing, or at least we're at the beginning of such a process. So I had some doubt as to whether they would actually go through with it, whether or not Putin and his henchmen would understand what they were embarking upon, but I certainly didn't rule it out. And it was clear after the 1999 apartment bombings, in which they murdered hundreds of their own people, that they didn't operate with any kind of moral restraint. So therefore, whether it was this crime or another crime, they were going to do something terrible to reinforce their hold on power. It turned out that it was the invasion, a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which I believe in part was the product of miscalculation on their part. But a regime run by a terrorist that is afraid of its own people is capable of practically any crime, and they've demonstrated that.
And with no conceivable moral limits either. I think that's what people get wrong
No,
about Putin.
no, they have a built-in justification that they for them the highest moral criterion is the interest of the state. And so therefore, if anything that they do, they can, for example, attack a school full of hostages with flamethrowers and grenade launchers, because killing all the terrorists is a vital state interest. As for the lives of the hostages, well, that's collateral damage. But I mean, any crime that they commit in their own interest, they can justify as being an act undertaken in the interest of the state. And they've even elaborated a kind of pseudo ideology to replace the old Marxist-Leninist ideology, which at least among themselves they use as a potent device of self-justification.
Before we deep into the sort of deep roots of the conflict, I think you've mentioned this current kind of instability. And in fact, there's one kind of shocking but quite intriguing event, isn't there? Which is the callous murder of Daria Dugina. I don't know if you agree with me, but this seems much more likely to be the result of internal struggles within Russia than something that would benefit the Ukrainian war effort.
Yes, I do agree. I do agree. In fact, I've written about this just recently. We don't know. There's a group that has claimed responsibility, the National Republican Army, so-called. We don't know if this is a real group, if it's something that's been invented. It could well be a group that does exist at some level, but it reflects the attitudes and goals of a faction in the leadership, which under any circumstances wants the war to end. But it is, the Ukrainian authorities would have they have enough on their minds and enough to deal with without going after propagandists in Moscow, of whom there are many.
And she was quite an
But
insignificant one, wasn't she? She wasn't one of the.
yes, well, she or her father were they in effect got a lot more, or he got a lot more publicity than he deserved for his harebrained theories. But he at the same time he became a potent symbol, and eliminating him could be the way in which one faction in Russia is speaking to the other faction. This often happens, even in business people, when they had disputes in Russia. It was a rather common thing, for example, to kill the director of security of the opposing economic group, just to demonstrate their intentions. I mean, the murder is part of unfortunately in Russia, became part of the normal process of conducting business. And this would be all the more true in the case of factional rivalry in the leadership. So whether or not there is a real terrorist group, a real national Republican army in any true sense, or whether this is a construct and a group of people who've been just hired to carry out something on behalf of a faction, nonetheless, we're seeing the first signs of possible internal conflict that could become very significant. It's not true that everyone in the Russian leadership is totally propagandized, and that everyone in the military and in the security services has lost their mind. There are people who understand how deadly this invasion and this whole adventure has been for Russia and would like to stop it. So unfortunately, we're left at the present moment largely with speculation, but in informed speculation would, I think, suggest that whether it's a newly formed terrorist organization or a group acting on behalf of a Kremlin faction, nonetheless, internal conflict and internal tensions are beginning to reach a point that's dangerous for the war effort and could really have an effect on the course of the conflict.
Another theory that I've heard discussed on Navalny's team's channel is that, again, it fits this theory of a signal being sent, but it could even be a signal of the FSB signaling to far-right groups that if Russia needs to somehow withdraw from the war and abandon the war, that these far-right groups should not oppose too vociferously, because there's been a lot of voices.
That could be part of it.
Yeah.
That could be part of it, but it's also we're getting into an area where we have very little to go on, and so we ought to tread very carefully. My view of this whole thing is that the most likely explanation is that one way or another, this is an act of a faction in the Kremlin leadership that either is opposed to the war as such or is opposed to the war in the way it's being waged, or doesn't oppose it but wants it, but realizes it has to stop. That's my guess. I think we'll wait and see what happens next. Subsequent events will, of course, clarify things. The one version that I don't think is plausible is that this was, as the Russians say, something organized by the Ukrainian intelligence. I think they have more important things to do to advance the war effort.
And it would require a lot of agents on the ground. It would be a very expensive operation to conduct on Russian soil. They have, I think, far more meaningful targets if indeed they do have people on the ground. And do you think there's a problem here with the Western media, who tend to latch on to fairly simplistic narratives, and they latched on to someone as Dugin, who is a Putin ally, when in fact his influence is probably limited? I don't know what your thoughts are there, whether he even has channels of communication with the Kremlin or not.
No, I don't know if he does or doesn't, but the war effort is not ideologically driven. That's the important thing. Any theory of Russian greatness or restoration of the empire or resistance to the West, all that's just camouflage. That's what's involved here is personal interest. And as grim and as frightening as that may be, this is a small group of people able to manipulate an unthinking mass against its own real interest, use them as cannon fodder in order to preserve its hold on power. Now, so the theories of someone like Dugin they may appropriate those, or they may come up with theories of their own that are equally ungifted, but the point of them is really to serve as some kind of justification. What in Russia they have this saying, "Information for fools," and it's something that they can pound into the heads of people, but not that they believe it themselves.
And to an extent, then the war itself is a miscalculation. What they were looking for was what they say in Russia, a маленькая победоносная война, a small.
No, good for you. If you
war.
speak, that's a good. Your Russian is very good. But the war was neither small nor victorious, as other small victorious wars, beginning with the Russo-Japanese War, turned out to be neither small nor victorious.
Could that lead, in some sense, to the sort of seismic changes, unintended consequences that happened in Russia at the end of the Russo-Japanese War, and to an extent as well, the way Finland's resistance to the Soviet Union put a bit of a check on the expansion of the Soviet Empire?
Could we don't know.
Mm,
Uh, the we the well the Russo-Japanese War, the failure in the Russo-Japanese War led to the revolution of 1905. As for the defeat in the Crimean War led to ultimately to the freeing of the slaves, the emancipation of the serfs. So where there's plenty of a precedent in Russian history for a defeat in war leading to fundamental changes, that we'll see what happens is,
mm,
if the Russians are indeed defeated, uh, or if they suffer if setbacks that can no longer be disguised or presented as a victory.
mm. Or to a
Could
period of
be, but
perhaps
but the
turmoil.
problem is the Russia needs a moral and psychological change. And for that, it needs the beneficent influence of the West. And the West itself is really uh, the post-Cold War West is little equipped to exert that kind of influence, especially insofar as we've turned inward and we're obsessed with things like race and gender discrimination, which, without commenting about how important or unimportant those issues are, they're not going to, make it possible for the West to exert international influence. Those aren't issues on the basis of which a country like Russia, which has a really authoritarian psychology, can be weaned away from it and convinced that individual human life and individuals have some sort of value.
And that's a good point, I think, to ask really about one of the major themes you've written about, and that's that Russia has never really reconciled itself to the horrors and crimes that were committed in the 1930s. Before Russia, transforms to understand that value of individual life, are they going to have to revisit their past first?
Well, that would be a fundamental contribution because all too often Russians regard the victims of communism, the victims of totalitarianism, as inevitable, the inevitable cost of modernization, or something, a product of history, or as unavoidable as the weather. They don't understand such a thing as human agency and moral responsibility. And the one way to counteract that, of course, is to memorialize those whose lives were taken away from them so pointlessly. But there was a start on that during the Perestroika period, when the idea of memorialization, commemoration, honesty about history, all those things were terribly important. But they were important in part because they could be used as a political weapon against the old regime. Once the regime had fallen, interest in those issues, was greatly diminished.
And those individuals who still pursued their ideas, they were fairly marginalized fairly quickly, weren't they? Like the founders of Memorial and these civil society institutions.
Yeah, I mean, more marginalized. They just lost their influence in society, even without deliberate marginalization. They were no longer useful. And the number of people who, there was a recrudescence in 1996 when Yeltsin ran against a communist candidate and needed symbols of uh, communist, symbols of communist or memorials to communist victims as a symbol of what awaited the country if the communists came back to power. But that again was a political motive rather than a purely moral motive. I mean, Yeltsin showed no real interest in commemorating victims when it was not to his political advantage. In fact, Yeltsin was the party official who was responsible for the demolition of the house in Yekaterinburg, but then it was called Sverdlovsk, where the Tsar Nicholas II was murdered along with the members of his family by Bolshevik assassins.
Absolutely. I think in your book, what's very telling and perhaps wasn't quite clear at the time, but became clear later on, is that the few sites that were found or admitted to for the mass killings in the 30s, probably only a fraction of the real number of sites that existed. Rather than being memorialized by society, they were handed over to the church, weren't they? And seeing, the pronouncements of the patriarch and the role of the church combined with the FSB and the state is kind of quite clear, isn't it, now, that those victims of terror were only seen as maybe, a step towards creating a new center of power, which would have been, the church-state alliance.
No, I mean the church was well. First of all, a lot of the burial places were not commemorated in any meaningful manner at all, and those that did exist were put under the authority of the church. I mean, many of the victims were not believers; they were not Russian Orthodox, and in any case, the church itself was subordinate to the regime, and Putin never misses an opportunity to clothe himself in these in religious symbolism in order to create the impression that he's some kind of a moral leader. So the church leaders are very much complicit in his crimes. I mean, this is a way of appropriating memory and using it even to a degree. They're ready to tell the story. They have a memorial to the victims in Moscow that they've created. Even Solzhenitsyn's Archipelago Gulag is assigned in schools, but it's within a framework which they prescribe, and an overall framework which glorifies the prerogatives of the state and basically supports a system which makes such crimes possible.
And it's difficult to understand, isn't it, how such a morally deficient person as Putin, gains so much power and in fact is able to retain the support of the elites that surround him. But is one of the reasons for this the failure to really condemn communism, its horrors, in the way that, say, Nazism was condemned in Germany?
That's one of the reasons, but the core problem was that there was no rule of law after the breakup of the Soviet Union. You had a situation in which the entire economic system was going to be changed from a system of state ownership to a system of private ownership, and it was done without any kind of moral rules. And this was a legacy of Soviet ideology, I should say. The notion that what counts is the economic system and that law, morals, ethics, culture are all derivative. So therefore, even though the young reformers considered themselves radical communists, they operated within a kind of communist Marxist intellectual framework. And their view was all we had to do was change ownership. Well, they did. They took ownership out of the hands of the state, put it in the hands of assets and factories and enterprises in the hands of private people. But this massive process, which it was probably the largest peaceful transfer of property, in world history, was accomplished without the benefit of law, and as a result, what you got was gangsterism. Now, how do you defend gangsterism? In a situation which still has at least formal elections, Well, with the use of provocation and terror. Who is capable of employing provocation and terror? Well, the former security services, now renamed. And once uh, terror has been used to solidify the hold on power of a criminal group, which is basically what happened, uh, then it's unrealistic to think that those who use terror will in order to seize power, will ever give it up, and they won't.
And they're not
So
just, sorry.
yeah, well, so I mean that's it. I mean the thing is now the failure to punish communists, to expose them, to renounce communism. This 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 was the failure to do those things that would have strengthened the culture and made it more likely that it would have been possible to establish the rule of law and respect for the individual. So that a potential barrier to this criminalization process was never created, neither in the institutions of the society nor in the mentality of people.
And you've also written compellingly, I think, about the role of doctrinism in Russian culture. And on the one hand, you've got this criminal group who've been able to coerce the wealth of the country and all the levers of power. But on the other hand, you also have a critical mass of people who seem perfectly happy to enslave themselves to an idea or just to power itself, even though that decision proves to be impoverishing to them or at worst lethal for them as individuals. How do you think this process works in Russia? Because it's very different to the Ukrainian attitude, isn't it?
Well, it works in every country to some degree. That people accept a set of uh, propositions uncritically, and then apply them to every political situation. This simplifies the world, and it relieves people of the obligation to think. In fact, it's actually quite a temptation, because once and this was very obvious in the Soviet Union, that the Soviet ideology, broken down to a few simple to understand precepts, relieved millions of people of the obligation to think for themselves. And at the same time, it engendered a certain feeling of superiority, paradoxical as that may be. Soviet citizens were very happy. They had the answers to every question. They had a formula that could be applied to anything, whether it was art, music, literature, politics, and they could be assured that, at least in the eyes of their country and their regime, uh, they were absolutely correct. Political correctness, which of course now is also an issue in the West, I mean, it got its start that way. The idea that some things are simply correct in and of themselves without reference to higher moral or intellectual authority, or to a serious reasoning process. And this is something that appeals not just to Russians. The difference is that in Russia, the political situation was such that this tendency was massively reinforced.
And that process indoctrinates you against evidence to some extent, doesn't it? And
It
with
shields you from evidence, because basically you establish a situation for yourself in which your identity is tied in an unhealthy way to a view of the world which is artificial, and therefore you're not. This is a big mistake that Westerners sometimes make, assuming that if Russians knew the truth, that they would immediately throw over some of their ideas, including support for the war against Ukraine. It's not necessarily true. In fact, it isn't true, because for ideas to have an effect, there has to be receptivity to those ideas. And there's not going to be receptivity if the set of views that a person has adopted and made a matter of personal identity are perfectly satisfactory for him. He's not going to welcome anything that upsets his mental equilibrium or forces him to think.
And to an
Now,
extent, yeah, sorry.
there are situations that can do that, of course. And there was cataclysmic psychological crisis after the fall of the Soviet Union in this respect. People, who had devoted their whole lives to a set of ideas suddenly felt their lives had been worthless and that they had been worthless.
And to an extent, without straying too far from Russia, I mean, that's perhaps the appeal of Trumpism and Brexit to an extent. They're ideas that provide a ready answer, a simple answer to issues that are inherently complex. And it's a similar kind of process.
It works on both sides. That's just the problem. I mean, we're very perceptive about seeing the degree to which, for example, in this country, in the U.S., the supporters of Trump, hold views that are harmful to them, harmful to the country. It's all true. We don't understand how our own behavior fuels that phenomenon and how we hold views. I mean, it was very, for example, and no one, and it's important to bear this in mind, no one with any real knowledge of Russia or the Soviet Union would have been fooled by the Trump collusion hoax. Mm-hmm. I saw the Steele dossier in 2017. I have the honor of being the first person to say it was false. But it was obvious Russian disinformation. Mm-hmm. But it dominated the American media for 3 years. Mm. Now, and then we say, well, you Trump people, you dopes, you don't trust the media. Yeah, of course they don't trust the media. Of course, they go a lot further and then come up with their own crazy ideas. Mm-hmm. The thing is, the number of people, you see, we live in a complex world, and we live in a world that actually, it's a paradox that oftentimes the better educated half of society, whether it's Britain or the U.S., is often the purveyor of some of the craziest misconceptions, because on the one hand, they take upon themselves the obligation to go beyond common sense and self-interest, but they don't accept the responsibility to really understand the issues and to get and so in fact, oftentimes they'd be better off if they hadn't even begun. Mm-hmm. This is a paradox, but it's something that has existed, for decades. Certainly during my lifetime. I mean, many of those people who supported progressive, so-called progressive, the word itself is absurd, but because progressive in what direction, but causes that were called progressive in the 1950s, 1960s, 1940s. With the passage of time, the information that we have about intelligence, intercepts, decoding, so we know that practically everything they said was wrong. The defenders of those supposedly being persecuted by crazy anti-communists. Well, the anti-communists were pretty crazy, but they weren't wrong. Mm-hmm. I mean, on the facts, they were correct, but they may not have known that either, because they operated also on emotion. We're at a kind of difficult juncture, really, because we want, of course, to bash the other side. Very tempting to do that, of course. We don't want to take responsibility for really understanding what we're talking about. And Russia, indeed, insofar as Russia is kind of at the center of this in many cases, doesn't make it easy because they're anxious to manipulate those differences. And those who are a little bit uninformed, they're determined to make really uninformed.
This is one of the it's one of the arguments.
And so it goes.
This is one of the arguments I have had over and over with people who would say, well, Russia today, if you're for free speech, if you're for the evolution of society, then you should say that Russia today should be allowed. And because some of what it says agrees with my point
you
of
mean
view,
the Russia Today television
yes,
the television
that's right.
station, yeah.
And I try to explain to people that just because this channel challenges conventional wisdom, just because in some respects it agrees with your radical point of view, doesn't make the intentions of that channel correct. What they've been able to do is to understand the fault lines in society and manipulate them, in fact, drive them further apart.
Well, that's what all Russian propaganda is intended to do. The more we're at each other's throats, the better for them. Russia today is a pure propaganda, is official Russian state propaganda, thinly disguised, and banning them is one thing. I mean, but allowing them to present themselves as something they aren't is something else. I wouldn't ban them necessarily, but I mean, how do you prevent them from pretending to be anything other than Russian state propaganda? That's a difficult question because of the pluralistic nature of our own press, or what. So I mean, perhaps the answer would be, yeah. I mean, maybe let them broadcast, but to the degree that we can, make clear to people what they are, and hope that people will be able to judge for themselves. My guess is that Russia today is less important. It has an appeal for certain marginal elements, but it doesn't sway opinion and do as much to create instability and mutual hatred as we do ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
A more serious threat than Russia today, if we're talking about the information environment, is the abandonment of journalistic and ethical standards by the mainstream media in the U.S., for example, and in Britain too, and in academia. I have had the benefit of a British education, by the way, and so I'm a little bit aware of what goes on in the UK. We pay a price for, I mean, what communism did. If we go back to the question of communism, what it did and what it sought to do was to abolish objective standards. There was the concept of class values. In other words, all values were determined by the interests of the most progressive class. If something was in the interest of the working class, this is Marxism, classic Marxism. Lenin is expressed by Lenin in his speech to the Komsomol in 1919. If something is in the interest of the working class, then it's moral by definition, because there's no higher goal for society than the revolution and the rule of the working class. So anything that advances that, even a terrible crime, is actually a moral act. Well, the effect of that was to destroy, and not just in the Soviet Union, but worldwide, the idea of objective standards, that there's something that is right or wrong, true or false, irrespective of the political context. Well, that's now, we didn't have communism in the US. We didn't have it in the UK. We didn't have it in other Western countries. But that tendency to treat, politics and political interest as the ultimate criterion exists in the West as well, and it's very destructive. And that's this, if you want to ask yourself what's the root of all this antagonism over what are actually fairly trivial issues, aggravating but trivial. We're not dealing with mass murder. We're not dealing with an invasion. We're not dealing with occupation. We're not dealing with summary executions. We're dealing with sexual harassment at the workplace, which I agree it's bad, or gender, discrimination against sexual minorities, or something. All these things are bad, but I mean it's not the same scale. But in assessing those issues, we've had a tendency to abandon objective standards. This is very, very obvious in the American press. We had we saw this, of course, with the Trump collusion hoax. It's interesting that the airwaves were filled with phony information. And I wrote for the National Review for the Wall Street Journal on this, and explained that this was Russian disinformation. But and that, as it has proven to be the case, and we'll hear more if John Durham, the special prosecutor, ever presents his report. But there was zero interest in listening to that point of view.
So that's Russia creating the impression of collusion as a kind of fodder for the media. Is that?
Well, they were feeding it. There was a market for it. There was a huge market. In this case, on the part of the Clinton campaign, it could have been on the part of the Trump campaign too. They're no better, but the Russians understood that they had a paying customer, and they provided them with stuff that could have only come from their disinformation department. And it was then circulated by an uncritical media for 3 years. Well, I mean, that has left lasting scars, because people, we say the Trump idiots now don't believe in the press. They don't believe in the intelligence services. Well, why should they after that? So the core point is that the communist destruction of objective standards, which was really at the root of all the atrocities, was facilitated by mental habits that exist in free societies as well, and which have gained ground in free societies, including the United States and Britain. Two places where you would most want them not to gain ground. I think that in talking about fidelity to fact, honesty about history, commemoration of victims, restoration of the value of the individual in Russia, we're talking about a necessary condition for the country's resurrection, morally and psychologically. But it's also important to bear in mind that some of these tendencies have affected us and have definitely diminished our ability to help the Russians, because it's sort of heal yourself. We if we want to help that process in Russia, then we have to think about what's happening in our own societies and why it is we are so susceptible to some of the same kind of thinking. Now, thankfully, because of democratic institutions, there are limits to how far it goes, but it no question that it's embittered and poisoned the internal atmosphere.
Can we perhaps therefore be a little optimistic, looking at Eastern Europe and Ukraine and seeing how hard they're prepared to fight for basic and absolute democratic values? Is there some cause for optimism looking at them?
Well, there is, I believe, and but bear in mind, uh, I think what is motivating the Ukrainians more, Ukraine has its own share of internal problems, and it did before the invasion, and it may have after what we hope will be their victory. But what is really motivating them is the integrity of the nation and the desire not to have the national identity destroyed and not to be dominated by force. They could, in theory, win the war and 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 revert to a very corrupt and not very democratic situation. Although they were definitely more democratic than Russia,
Mm.
before the invasion. So I wouldn't necessarily attribute all this to a victory of democracy, or as a defense of democracy, as so much as a defense of the Ukrainian nation, which is not the same thing. But still,
Identity, language, war.
seeing, yeah, and the nation, language, culture, all those things.
Mm-hmm.
But and fear of the barbarism of Russian occupation, which they definitely already demonstrated.
Mm.
But the but beyond all that, uh, I think that we should bear in mind that their victory would be a huge, potentially huge contribution to the development of a democratic consciousness in both Russia and Ukraine.
And could that help us towards perhaps understanding the origins of the crisis? I mean, we already have sort of discussed how internal issues and the fragility of Putin's regime would have led him to start a small, in his mind, a small,
Victorious
quick,
war, yes,
victorious war.
yeah.
But at the same time, did he also not fear that Ukraine could become a template, not for a purely democratic society, but a template for a process of evolution towards a more pluralistic society?
Absolutely, and that's why they launched. That's why they launched the invasion of Crimea, the annexation of Crimea, the invasion and war in eastern Ukraine, in order to distract Russian opinion from the Ukrainian democratic example. Because after all, Euromaidan saw hundreds of thousands of people in the street. It was a spontaneous, democratic, self-organizing protest. Now, the and it led to the overthrow of a kleptocratic ruler. Well, that's a precedent that the Russians would have found intolerable, because the regime controls the levers of power in Russia, but it's vulnerable to that type of mass protest.
Mm.
Those crowds that big would be impossible, might prove impossible to suppress, or the security services and the police might prove unwilling to open fire, and might turn their guns on the people who were giving them the orders. And that's a prospect that frightened them a lot, and that was what led first to the seizure of Ukraine, and ultimately to what's happening now, because they had, to, on the one hand, by launching a new invasion, they counted on a resurgence of patriotic support for them on the basis of misguided patriotism. Of course, they imagined that this would be quick, and a quick victory, like the quick annexation and bloodless annexation of Crimea. They thought something similar was likely to happen. And at the same time, that they hoped, I believe, that reaction would smother any thoughts about imitating the or following the Ukrainian example, and especially the example of the Euromaidan revolt.
in speaking to many people, as I have been doing, and knowing quite a few Russians personally, it seems to me one of the most persistent and deep propaganda narratives that has really been inherited from the Soviet period and actively propagated by the current regime is that democracy cannot work in Russia, that Russians somehow are genetically incapable of creating a democratic society. And that seems to create a sort of level of apathy. Well, why even try to resist if it's never
Why
going
even
to work?
bother with these hopeless people?
Yes. Yeah, why should I even, put my head above the parapet if that's all hopeless? And if Ukraine, if Belarusia are seen to develop a civil society,
That would have a
uh,
massive influence, of
mhm,
course. Yeah, because the Ukrainians, I mean, they are Slavs. They're culturally different, but there are many families that have many people in Russia were born in what is now Ukraine. Many Ukrainians spent time in Russia. Many there, you know, I mean, it's ridiculous to talk about mixed marriages, but they're marriages in which one person, came from Ukraine, one person came from Russia, and there are relatives and family ties and friendships, and people studied in Ukraine. Ukrainians, one time or another, worked in what is now Russia. So, yeah, I mean, a functioning, prosperous democracy in Ukraine would have a huge impact on the situation in Russia. I mean, the Russian regime is archaic in many ways, and it's too archaic for the modern society that Russia has become.
mm.
And it would, uh, so that's what they fear. It would work, of course, to the benefit of the Russian people, and get them off their knees and give them dignity in a way that that they haven't been able to achieve. But that's exactly what the Putin regime wants to prevent. And in this respect, the Putin regime is the enemy of both the Russian people and the Ukrainians, even though the Russians are the ones who are being used against the Ukrainians, as we know.
So my last question really sort of wraps that up. So to an extent, do you think the fate of Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia are intimately tied together?
Oh, they are. They're definitely tied together because, especially in light of this aggression, because they had a common fate in the sense that they were all parts of the Soviet Union. They all underwent the spiritual and moral and intellectual destruction that was wrought by the imposition of communist ideology, and they're all recovering to one degree or another, as we see in Belarus and Russia, not very well, and in Ukraine only partially. But the example of the advantages of democracy and the benefits for everyone, and the artificiality, which would of course highlight the artificiality of the situation. And Russia's a group, a place in which by some estimates, 35% of the national wealth is controlled by a very, 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 very small kleptocratic group. So definitely that would be a huge factor in the democratization and demilitarization of the region and the removal of the threat of further violence. That's what, in a sense, that's why Ukraine is so worthy of our support.
And in a fragile system, it could be the domino that triggers other changes. Lukashenko may not survive Ukrainian victory. Putin himself will come under severe pressure if Lukashenko collapses.
We assume those things could happen, but regardless of what happens to Lukashenko and Putin, the example of a successful democratic society in Ukraine would be very infectious. And it would definitely have an effect on the social consciousness of no matter how state television in Russia tried to disguise it, because and of course the fact of defeat, if there is a defeat, would be ultimately impossible to hide.
And there's 4 million people who have fled the country, the nascent sort of middle class who aren't plugged into state TV. If they were to return, theoretically, that also would be very destabilizing. But that's by no means certain that they would return.
They won't return under existing conditions, but they would return after I think in a post victory, a situation that developed after the victory of Ukrainian arms, and then they would of course be a massive stimulus for the democratic development of the country.
Well, David, that's a relatively positive note to end our conversation on. There are literally a million questions that I could still ask you. We haven't even touched upon the criminalization of Russia in the 90s. There are tons of things to explore there, but unfortunately the time is up. For anyone that has not read David's books, I sincerely advise you to read them. They're both enlightening and terrifying and indispensable to read in the current situation. It's been a great pleasure speaking with you, and I'm really grateful that you've made so much of your precious time available.
Oh, I'm happy to do so. I look forward to talking to you again.